If I die young, bury me in satin, lay me down on a bed of roses, ink me in the river at dawn, send me away with the words of a love song. If I die young, bury me in satin, lay me down on a bed of roses, ink me in the river at dawn, send me away with the words of a love song.
As I began my research on this taboo topic, I began to wonder why this issue was taboo in the first place. If the topic were that a certain minority group was being disenfranchised or systematically discriminated against in, say, for example, civil courts or criminal courts, we would have heard an outcry from civil rights groups all across the country. There would be protests in the streets. But when millions of men seek fair treatment in the eyes of the family courts, our society turns the other way, ordering them to accept the rubber stamp ruling in mom's favor. Take them like marching orders to war, suck it up, and simply do as you're ordered. And the argument of what's best for the kids? Well, modern-day mental health experts almost all agree, barring those with drug, alcohol, or other abuse issues, gender of parents aside, it's in the best interest of all children to have both parents equally in their lives.
Load up on guns, bring your friends, it's fun to lose and to pretend she's overboard and self-assured. I know, a dirty word. Hello.
Suzanne Venker, author of The War on Men. Suzanne, nice to see you, as always, on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so what do you make of these feminists, these professional feminists, as Tucker calls them, outraged over this group of men getting together to talk about things like finances? In fact, at this event, they had female speakers and all sorts of different races.
Oh, it was undoubtedly the most diverse group that I have ever been among at one time. It was fantastic. Males, like you said, males, females, black, white, liberals, conservatives, atheists, Christians. I mean, all united for one very specific reason, and that's to talk about the needs of boys and men, which are terribly underrepresented today. So it's almost comical to think about the lashing out that feminists did, because the actual conference couldn't have been more opposite of what they claimed.
Suzanne, why are they acting out then, if that's the case?
Okay, so the biggest divide between what's called the MRAs, the men's rights activists, and feminist activism is really very simple, and that is that feminists blame all social ills, all the problems that we have, really, especially regarding marriage and the family, education, jobs, and the like, on the patriarchy. You know, whenever something goes wrong, it's the man's fault, and it's the system, and it's all messed up. When men's rights activists come together to truly address these problems, all they're interested in is just solving the problem. So the point is, anytime someone tries to speak out and address the real issues that revolve around the male-female relationship, marriage, family, domestic violence, by the way, goes both ways. People don't know that because feminists own the dialogue when it comes to these topics. The assumption is that women are always victims and men are the perpetrators. That is absolutely statistically false.
We are here to say, as women, we're not taking it anymore. R-E-S-P-E-C-T. What you want? 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 Baby, I got it. What you need? You know I got it. All I'm asking is for a little respect. All I'm asking is for a little respect.
guys being here is fine.
What's considered part of the highway? Sorry.
This whole area.
Oh, just this road?
all the way. So if you guys could take the tent down, that would be fantastic.
part of the highway.
The area that
Yeah.
you're on.
Where's that?
Yeah, I know. I am a bit confused as to how, which street is this again? To be honest, I don't even remember.
We are the ones who are left with that trauma, okay? Our friends, us, our bodies, we are the ones that have to bear that trauma.
Shut it down! Sexism! Shut it down! Misogyny! Shut it down! The whole damn system! Shut it down! Sexism! Shut it down! Yes! No means no! Blame the system, not the victim! Blame the system!
There are things that you can do, and you need to fight back, and you need to take any anger and hurt and anxiety you have and put it into action. Show up for things like what we have here today, because only if the people stand up to tyranny will things ever change, and what we have is judicial tyranny.
I think someday in the future, when shared parenting is the norm, when the family court systems have been reformed, I think we're going to look back on this era, the way we look back on the Dark Ages, as a very barbaric era where people are just going to scratch their heads and they're just going to not believe that this is the way we handle this.
Okay, I felt it was a necessary precursor to put an emphasis on the absolute lunacy going on in our social climate, out of respect for Mike, because he was definitely a victim, at least partially to it. We got a big problem with people being outraged. There's selective outrage, and their outrage is directed at the wrong things. They are letting emotion drive them, and it is in turn villainizing people that have done no wrong. So with that being said, let's get chapter 2 started. Here's Mike's story. If you haven't watched chapter 1, I'll leave a link. You might want to watch chapter 1 to get caught up to where we are. I'll leave a link, and in the top right hand corner of your screen you will see a link right there to get to chapter 1 so you can get caught up. There is also a prelude to chapter 2 that you can also watch. Alright, so let's go. Picking up where I left off. So by the time I had moved out of the sheer madness of home, I left behind a train wreck. The battle continued, and eventually my little sister was taken by DCF. Luckily, the same great-grandmother that took care of myself, and eventually Sage, was still alive and kicking to pick up my mother's bill once again. And inevitably, the quagmire between my mother, my stepdad Michael, and the state landed squarely on Michael's shoulders. Mike was to go to prison. 1 year. When Mike got out, he briefly moved back to Jersey and then back home. Mike just wanted to be with his daughter. At this point, my mother had moved in with my grandmother, her mom, not the great-grandmother that took care of me and Sage. Michael was staying at one of his friend's house for a while. After some time, Michael moved back in with my mother and grandmother and eventually got Sage back. Of course, it wasn't long before the battles raged on once again. My mother and grandmother seemed to share a relentless and unforgiving disdain for Michael. So the fighting became a trifecta. Mom and Graham in the blue corner, Mike in the red. Let's get ready to rumble. Pills versus alcoholism. Mike was not a violent man, thankfully, but lacked the discernment on when it is a good time to call it quits. Mike was fighting a losing battle, and he certainly wasn't fighting with logic and reason. Mike was a man who made many mistakes. He said and did irrational things and wasn't much of a forward thinker, but this was Mike, who he was, and I can understand the frustration of being with a man like that, but he did not deserve to be relentlessly chastised and provoked and beaten down. That kind of treatment from those you unconditionally love is quite literally the antithesis of supporting your family. Eventually, Mike made the right decision by leaving, but with Mike being Mike, this decision was followed by a very bad decision, a new drug addict girlfriend. Now, I'll spare you the details, but obviously that quickly fell apart, and back to my mom he went. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, I don't think it was mentally handicapped. Mike moved back in with my mom, and they were back to square one. As things inevitably escalated, Michael found a new love in his life, my mother's pain pills. Thus begins the downward spiral that sent Michael straight into his demise. By this time, I had been through my own downward spiral that I will be discussing in chapter 4. Once I was released from prison, I eventually found a woman that I would eventually marry. An amazing woman, full of love, self-respect, and understanding. Unconditional love. The antithesis of what I grew up around. It was liberating and refreshing, a new life. But sometimes the mind of an addict plagued with clinical depression simply doesn't care if your circumstances have changed for the better. The battle is within, and whatever or whomever is on the outside becomes irrelevant. I relapsed 3 years into our marriage, and things began to fall apart. After a serious fight, I decided to leave, at least until things cooled down a little bit, and the only place that I had to go was my mother's. And with my relapse in full swing and my fuck the world mentality since leaving home, I hit the gas. Anything goes. Fuck it all. I spent 2 weeks getting so drunk and high that one day after a 5-day bender with no sleep, I thought the house was surrounded by police. So high, in fact, I could see them and was negotiating with them. I eventually crashed and slept for nearly 2 days. One night in particular stands out in my drug-hazed memory. Mike and I were out bar hopping. He had been fighting with the household as usual, and we decided to leave and blow off some steam. I remember driving between the bars and Mike saying, "Pull over, I gotta pee." And he got out and stumbled to some bushes and he just fell over. And on his 20-foot walk back to the car, he must have fallen about 5 times. You know, looking back now, if I wasn't in such a bad shape, I would have been concerned, maybe offered help. But I couldn't even help myself at this point. But hindsight is 20/20. We made it back home by way of some kind of miracle. And as soon as we walked in the door, it began. The onslaught. Mike was in bad shape and had already graduated from pain pills to heroin. And after my mother and grandmother finished their relentless ear beating on Mike, they kicked him out. So I helped him pack and move into a small apartment with a guy he knew. As I helped move his 2 garbage bags of belongings upstairs to the apartment, a black SUV pulled up. Mike said, "He's here. Do you want anything?" I said, No, I'm spent." He comes back from that SUV that I will never forget with a gram of heroin. We finished up. I told him to keep his head up. Maybe it's time to call it quits, get your own place, start over, make a new life for yourself. He just looked down and said, I know. So I gave him a hug. I told him to give me a call. Maybe, you can come down to the house and have a few beers sometimes. The wife and I were working things out. So after I said goodbye, I drove back to my mom's. I packed up and I went home. My bender and irrational reaction to my problems was over. Things at home were smoothing out, and it wasn't much more than a week later that I got the phone call. Mike had overdosed on that same apartment floor that I had helped him move into. My apologies if that dictation there was a bit aloof. I had to write that down because I wanted to keep a linear timeline on it. So when we got that call, we went to the hospital, and there's Mike. I see Mike that I had just... My last memories of Mike was him stumbling from that car, me helping him move into that little apartment with that guy, and him buying a bag of heroin, me driving away. That was the last time I was to see Mike. We had been through a lot in our family, a lot of pain, a lot of turmoil. There were times that my mom would tell me all kinds of things about Mike, what he did, and it took me a while to realize that she was often the aggressor. There were times that I even went out looking for Mike to beat his ass because of what he did to her. But now I have to wonder whether or not she did it to herself after I seen her beating herself up, bruising herself for when the cops came so she can blame shit on him and get him sent to jail. Mike wasn't a bad guy. He was an addict. It turned out to be an addict. He was an alcoholic. He was a bit of a fuck up on a lot of things, but like I said in my previous one, the man loved his family and he really just wanted to be with his family. The poor son bitch just couldn't get right, and he surely had no help. He had no support whatsoever. Matter of fact, quite the opposite of support. He was consistently beaten down. And I do this for Mike because he needs his voice heard. He needs his side told. Was Mike a bit of a fuck up? Yes. Did he make a lot of mistakes? Yes. Did he lack the faculties to make right decisions in certain situations? Yes. Yeah. He was a beta guy. He wasn't an aggressive man. He wasn't a man's man. But he wasn't a bad man either. We have to ask ourselves, to what standard do we hold people to? And once we hold them to that standard, if they're your loved ones, what do we do about it? Do we chastise them for it? Or do we confront them and try to help? Do we try to offer a hand out? One thing that I learned from Mike in Mike's passing is something that we overlook often as people, is how much of an effect that we have on one another by way of how we treat one another. This goes to the golden rule, man. do unto others. People aren't perfect. Nobody's perfect. But everybody deserves love. Everybody deserves to be cared for. And it sometimes can be hard, because I know when I saw Mike laying there lifeless on that hospital bed, all the shitty things that were said to him and done to him just flashed through my head. And there were times that when I was younger, I participated in the group think, and I felt like he was a bad guy. But that was when I was much younger. And I just stood there and stared at Michael lifeless in the hospital bed, tears streaming down my face, and I just said, man, I'm fucking sorry. I'm sorry. Mike deserved better, but he also deserved to do better by himself. We need to be there for each other. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. When it comes to relationships, if you are dealing with somebody with an addiction or something like that, there are only two answers. You either support them and try to help them through it, or leave them, because if you do anything else, it's just going to hurt them. Do not stick around to chastise them. Do not stick around to tell them how shitty of a person they are, how many mistakes they've made. You're kicking a dead horse. I mean, I know me personally, if you sit and tell me about the things that I did in the past, which I will be myself talking about in chapter 4, it's laughable. You're kicking a dead horse. I'm my own worst critic. I guarantee you I beat myself down for the mistakes that I've made in my life and the shitty things that I've done when I was a drug addict more than anybody else. And I deal with it on a daily basis. The guilt is there always. You know, seeing my little sister being used as a bargaining chip because, you know, she knew Mike loved that little girl so much. It's doing shit like that is just some of the most heinous shit, to use a child as a bargaining chip and using them against somebody. That is just heinous. I think I'll end it here. I love you, Mike. Rest in peace. Manic Asylum.